Genova Burns has been servicing corporate clients for over 35 years. John Quincy Adams said it best: whoever tells the best story wins. Here's our story. I'm Sandra Bograd, and I'm of counsel here at Genova Burns. Today we're going to be talking about regulation, or rather the aspect of deregulation and the prospect of deregulation that we are hearing about daily in the newspapers as we go into a new administration and get kicked off in a new season of business. There's an old adage that says, "May you live in interesting times." Sometimes that sounds like a good thing, and sometimes that sounds like an ominous, maybe scary thing. We are living in interesting times, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Not only are we in the United States living in the interesting times of deregulation, but economies all over the world are living in the same kind of times and taking the same kind of actions. So while we hear about it here in the United States every day, several times a day sometimes, about a new area that's being deregulated or an executive order calling for something to change in the way we do business, keep in mind that in Argentina, they've wielded a chainsaw. Those are the words of the Argentine president. They've wielded a chainsaw to regulation and red tape. In India, they're taking steps to change triplicate processes and having to sign things in triplicate to get something done and shorten the amount of time it takes to be innovative. In Britain, there are changes every day in their Department of Transportation trying to change the way they fix their airports and change their transportation systems. And even in New Zealand, there's a new anti-regulation movement. And in Vietnam, believe it or not, in Vietnam, there is a plan to shrink the bureaucracy. So it's happening all over the world. Why is that important to talk about? Well, done right, the anti-red tape is a good thing. Think about it. Should it take us 16 years to build a building in a major city? Because we have so much red tape. Without that red tape, and if we have a real reduction in red tape and bureaucratic regulation, we could foster greater, faster economic growth. Maybe there'll be lower prices, new technologies will emerge. But if we do this wrong, and we do it badly, we'll be in chaos. That's what we want to talk about today, is what are some of the questions that are emerging as we look at deregulation, what's good, maybe what's bad. How can we avoid this being, as I heard someone describe it, a Jackson Pollock painting, which is what it looks like right now. Things just thrown against the wall without real thought about how they're going to get implemented. So let's think about that. Let's think about the countries that did it well and saw some benefit from taking time to plan, and the countries that didn't do it well and are now seeing some chaos in their markets. Things aren't turning out the way they planned them to be. And then let's talk about some questions you should be asking yourself about where your company ought to be and what you ought to be thinking about in this era of change and regulatory dissonance, for lack of a better word. So I think we all agree burdensome regulations should be gone, and we should move on and try to do business more cleanly, more effectively, more efficiently, and things will move faster, we'll be more innovative, we'll make more money, and we'll be better at our jobs. But as I said, think about doing this in a very specific and directed way. Otherwise, what happens? Let me suggest to you that if all of these cost-cutting and federal employee reductions and business reductions in staff occur before we change the rules and regulations, I suggest to you we may have just bought ourselves more backlog, more confusion, more time delays, because there won't be enough people to manage what are now the current regulatory requirements. Studies tell us today that over 12 billion hours a year are spent in the US complying with regulations. That's a lot. Maybe that's wasted time, but right now it's required of businesses, or they'll face fines, penalty, enforcement actions. What if we lived in a world in which we didn't have to do that and we could focus on our businesses? That might be a good thing. When these regulations ultimately go away, that requires us as business owners and business people to create our own set of regulations, to look at our own businesses, to not rely on check the box of what the government is telling us to do. Some regulation is good. Some regulation helps us to face the risks of market failures. And it would be naive to think that regulation in some places isn't good. Let me give you some good examples of key deregulation in the United States that has occurred before now. Things like airline deregulation in 1978 made it easier for competition and made a marketplace where more companies can enter the airline business. So we have more choices, we have more places to go. Now the question is, was enforcement of how people manage their airplanes and keep them in the air good enough? But that's a story for another day. The telecommunications deregulation, when we broke up AT&T, with expanded service availability, more people could enter the marketplace. There was more innovation, more technology, all good. Financial deregulation. 1999, there was the Glass-Steagall Act, and there was deregulation of what was then a moribund system. So finally, banks could merge with each other, and they could have insurance practices, and they could have other kinds of businesses. And energy deregulation, which allowed for the growth of all kinds of new energy and energy sources. Those were all good reasons, and those were all good deregulation activities. But they suddenly became moribund, meaning that there was a place for more regulation, and regulation begat regulation. And suddenly we went from having 20,000 pages of a federal code to 180,000 pages of a federal code of regulations. So we've really gone over the top. People who make regulations like to have jobs at in regulatory agencies. And so when we look at it, we think, well, maybe this isn't a bad thing to get rid of some of the extra people in government and extra people in regulatory agencies and extra work that's being done and extra triplicates. Maybe it's not a good thing if some law or health code says that because it's a safety code for food service and food production, that some child can't run a lemonade stand on the corner of his block. Maybe that's not a good thing, and that ought to be gone. So that's what we think about as red tape, but the basics still have to be there. We would be naive after the financial crisis of 2008 to think that we don't need some regulation of the financial markets and financial services. But right now, we're living in a world where we just don't know what's coming next, right? We have executive order after executive order that's saying we should reduce, not only in the Trump administration, reduce not only the regulations that are on the books to relieve some of the enforcement actions that are already in place, but also to give greater power to the executive branch to be able to take over what were previously independent agencies in other administrations. So that's where we are. That's the news. Let's talk about what questions we ought to be asking ourselves for that and what we can do about it. We have to look at this as being both a good idea and a bad idea. And what can we ask ourselves? How do we do what we need to do as business people? How do boards make sure that the business keeps going and management make sure that business keeps keeping on, and that all of the ancillary industries, whether it be insurance or brokers or suppliers and supply chain partners, global and domestic, how do we make sure that we all keep moving along to achieve the goals of our business, which are, in fact, to produce a profit for our investors? How do we do that? Well, to me, one of the questions you ought to be asking yourselves is, do we really rely on the rules to set the framework and the governance framework for our business? Or do we do that having done a risk assessment of our own business? Do we know the culture of our business? Do we know what we do every day? Do we know, is our rule set or our governance structure based on where we do business, who we do business with, what we're hoping to achieve as a company, what our mission is, and where we're going? I think once you do that, and once you start to ask yourself those questions and create those answers for yourself within the business, you take away sort of the dissonance and the irrationality of government changing regulations. If you know how you do business, and it is the right way to do business, you can be consistent, and you can be steady, and you can continue to do your business and continue to foster innovation within the work and the locations, meaning geographies and supply chains that you want to work with and build in your own resiliency. So what does that mean for the near future, and what should we be thinking about? Well, I think within your companies in the near term, what you ought to be thinking about and working with both your internal legal and compliance and governance board and control people, as well as your external providers of all of those services. I think you ought to be looking at privacy and data security. How does your company use data? What is it using? How are you managing it? Where are you sending your data? And where is it being lodged? Where is it being warehoused? And then take that and look at what your plans are for AI. What's your roadmap look like for that? And are you protecting all of that? AI isn't going to ask you to have less data security. It's going to ask you to have more. And you may not have the government to tell you what that looks like. And so you ought to be thinking about risk analysis of what it looks like for you as a company. And setting that up and finding contracts with your external vendors that are vetted and properly in place to make sure that everybody understands what their role and responsibility is to meet what you want to do with your company and the culture of your business. Next thing you ought to think about, I think, is as you develop these innovative ideas and you start to think about emerging businesses and industries and emerging products really to meet where we are going in the future. And it's a positive future, I think. I'm trying to be optimistic about that. Where are we going to go with the future? I think one of the things you got to think about is making sure that your company understands its own culture. You've worked with your council to figure out where do we merge, what mergers will work for us, where will companies and cultures work with your compliance team, your HR team, figure out where do your cultures match with companies you may be merging with. If you're growing synthetically, if you're growing organically, thinking about will this new business meet the need, merge with the businesses you're in? Will you meet break-even points quickly? Those are some things that you ought to think about and structure appropriately to make sure you don't have any skips in the future and you're moving forward, because there will not necessarily be the same kind of regulation check the boxes, both at the federal and state level that you may have seen before. We think the antitrust department, if it's the case of a merger, we think the antitrust department at the federal level is going to be very pro-business. That ought to reflect in the states. But if you're in the big tech business, that could be very different. So take a look at that and see what you're willing to, what your company can bear and how you might be able to protect yourself by building in your own set of risk mediators. The next place you ought to be thinking about is investment management. That's a changing world right now. Regulations are changing quickly around things that we thought were baked in, such as DEI requirements on your board, what were best practices. Federal government is changing fast, but federal governments all over the world are not changing fast. So, for instance, in the United States, there's a real displeasure if you have a specific DEI program in place coming from the federal government. You know, that's a new executive order to the SEC. And companies are being punished for strong DEI programs with investigations. But Canada just announced that DEI at the for securities and publicly traded companies will be very important, and they will look to see what are the DEI initiatives, what are the programs, and what's in place. So what do you do if you're a company that's got business in Canada and business in the United States? Again, these are things that I would suggest your counsel can help you with, we can help you with, figuring out how do you move forward in those structures, how do you move forward where there is that disconnect. So really important. I think litigation is certainly going to start to pop up, whether it's because people can't meet whatever the requirements were with the contract that was formed when regulations were different, or because people are just confused about where they ought to be and how they deliver on their contracts. And by the way, I think that litigation is going to be at the federal level. We'll certainly see a lot of litigation. At the state level, we'll see litigation where there's going to be a controversy or a conflict between what now is state law and what may become federal law, and how businesses on the commercial side carry things out. B2B litigation may occur if we can't meet certain requirements that were put into contracts, and now those regulations have changed and maybe even forbidden the way that we meet our contract obligations. And then finally, are investors and shareholders. There may be additional litigations coming up on the securities fraud case or on in a derivative suit or derivative action if you're a publicly traded company, because oftentimes investors say, well, why didn't the board oversee this? Why didn't the company look at this? Why didn't somebody anticipate that regulations were going to change? I think that's really going to be a question for the ages to be asked, but I'm not sure anybody could have seen that we were going to be in this situation quite this quickly. And so people will often litigate. As we know, our current president likes litigation. He likes to go to court. And so there is an encouragement, at least for the federal government, to go to court to enforce what they believe are their own contracts. If you're sitting and holding a government contract, there may also be litigation there, and we can help you take a look at that. I think a couple of the other areas you might want to ask and start looking at: how do you regulate yourself and make sure your governance is in place in a way that's good for your business when there's less regulatory guidance or requirement. And that's sort of around the idea of, for publicly traded companies, around securities laws, where is the SEC going, what will enforcement look like, and around your own governance. Waiting for the SEC to tell you how to govern your company has only been ever about setting a baseline. How you run good, resilient companies is about how you do it within your own organizations and how you think about what's good for the business, the locations. I know I've said that before, but your business, your geographies, your supply chains, and what you ultimately want to accomplish as a mission for your company. Maybe it's time to go back and look at mission statements and making sure that everybody who works in your business understands that. Another area to start thinking about is there will be no regulation, as far as we can tell right now, at least not in the near term, around AI and funding rounds for AI companies and startups. So start thinking about what that means to your company if you think you want to go into that area. Get advice. We will talk to you about how those funding rounds ought to look to meet and achieve your goals and your financial plan, and what your roadmap looks like going forward. Most companies are just saying they're going to have an AI project on the roadmap, but what does that really mean, and what does that really look like for your particular business? And then finally, I think we have to start thinking about whether or not any of these changes are going to affect the financial health of the company and management's liabilities that they've incurred in a company, building it out to meet what was the previous regulatory extremes or regimes, and what will be the future regulatory regimes. And so I think we have to necessarily look at bankruptcy advisory, mostly on the restructuring side, and thinking about whether or not your companies are structured to meet the brave new world that we'll be entering into, and are you in a good spot to be able to do business and to avoid the possibility of a Chapter 11, and is that the right way to go? So my suggestion will be, as we move forward, your companies and boards ought to be looking at that and making sure that they have the right structure in place, that they're prepared to move forward, that whatever liabilities have been incurred by management are being dealt with or restructured so that you can meet your financial and your fiscal goals over the next short term and then ultimately long-term periods. And then finally, on the finance side, we come to, what do we do about crypto? What do we do about new methodologies of payment, B2B and consumer to business, and within our supply chains? What does it mean for our banks to say that they're going to go to a crypto, that they're going to set up a crypto facility? And do you want a crypto facility? Those are all questions that you need to understand the legal ramifications for, and that your board needs to understand. So I'm going to come to a close, because I think I raised a lot of questions for you to go back and ask and think about. But the one thing I will say in closing is most important is, from a governance perspective, between you and your board and management, very important to make sure that you all understand what questions are the important ones to ask, and to make sure you bring the right people into the room to ask the questions of. We live in, the real danger here could be if we continue to live in silos and we evaluate our siloed businesses by whether or not they've met some regulatory requirement that isn't actually going to be there anymore. So I would think about that, and then also think about building in additional time in the runway. If we think that these regulations are going away, and they do, but there are fewer people to impose, to work at the agencies or to approve laws that have not yet been changed, make sure that you build in the additional time it's going to take to get things done as we move forward. But as I said, I'm optimistic. With the right help and the right advisors, I think we can make a stand and make sure that business not only does well, but does better than it's done in the past. Thank you.